At Rubberband, we empower each other through positivity, kindness, and practical advice. Join a community of thousands of peers who understand the unique challenges you face. Rubberband. Company agnostic, low ego, high empathy, always supportive. And we are live. Welcome, listeners, to today's episode of the Rubberband podcast, where I am joined by extra special guest, Tim Freestone from Alooba, for another episode of the Talent Tech series. Now, before we begin... Hi, Tim. Hi. That's all right. Let's keep going. But hi. And I'll say hi again in a moment. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I live and work on, the Wadawurrung and Dja Dja Wurrung people. I recognise their continuing connection to the land and waterways. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I would like to extend this to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, the most eager and exciting guest I've ever had that jumped in with a hello right at the start. Hello, Tim. How are you?
I'm fantastic. And as you can see, overexcited. I'm to the fourth coffee today. And you'd think after running 130 episodes of our own podcast, I could wait for the right timing. But there you go. Just too keen today.
130. I'm getting close to 200.
Oh, wow.
It's a bloody marathon, though, hey?
Yes, it is. But it's cool. You get to speak to interesting people, meet different characters,
Tell me about your podcast.
It's called The Objective Hiring Show. And I called it that because it's something we might come on to a little bit later. I feel like traditionally hiring, not necessarily that fair. The best candidate maybe doesn't always get the job. There's a lot of bias, a lot of subjectivity. And so it's a conversation with different hiring leaders about how we can make hiring a little bit fairer.
Fantastic. And is available Apple, Spotify?
Yeah, all those places. The clips are probably a good place to start. We've got a lot of YouTube shorts, so you get the kind of 20, 30-second little snippets of gold, some funny stuff as well, some good anecdotes, something for a bit of everyone there.
Oh, fantastic. Well, it's on my list, and listeners out there, you love Rubberband, you're going to love Tim's podcast as well. So jump on there and give it a follow. Now, Tim, I always start these. Before we start talking about Alooba, I want to talk about you. I want to hear about your journey and how you got to the point of launching Alooba. So let's go back. Let's go back to young Tim, your childhood. Tell me about growing up. Where are you from? Tell me about your family. Talk me through your childhood.
Yeah, so I grew up in Wollongong, just south of Sydney. It's about a couple of hours south of Sydney. Lived in the same house, same primary school, same high school, one university. So I had a lot of stability in childhood, played a lot of sport, the kind of quintessential 90s upbringing, cricket, football, anything with a ball, really, a lot of beach stuff. So in some ways idyllic, but in some ways not, some kind of combination like anyone has. And yeah, that was a fun time and experienced the pre-internet world. I think that's probably the biggest gift that I feel like I had now. Is I remember a time before the internet, before smartphones, which is a little bit simpler, a little bit more disconnected, a little bit more relaxed maybe. And yeah, that was growing up in the 90s.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so I can relate to that. And I wasn't far from you, actually. I used to spend weekends in Wollongong quite a lot. I'm from Campbelltown, I grew up. But
oh, yeah, not too far away.
Not too far away. Bit of a different vibe, though, than Wollongong, but good old idyllic childhood as well, right? Like you've got the south coast of New South Wales at your doorstep. It's pretty fabulous. But
can't complain.
Yeah, and I can relate to growing up without the technology. I mean, I was a pre-internet as well. I mean, we didn't really have the internet in high school when I was doing my HSC and. All of our exams were handwritten. We were still going through encyclopedias. It's amazing where technology is now when you think back to our childhood, right?
Yeah, it's a staggering development, especially in the last couple of years with AI. I mean, things are moving just so quickly.
Absolutely. And when you were there in Wollongong in high school, where did you think your career was going to take you? What were you into? What was your thinking at that stage, or even university?
So when I was a bit younger, option one would have been a soccer player. So it would have been living the ultimate dream. But probably wasn't talented enough and didn't try hard enough. So that's a deadly combination.
Yeah.
But then once I got a little bit older, once I was a teenager, then I thought about different things. I thought about architecture, I thought about civil engineering, ended up studying business, which is a reasonable all-round kind of degree where you learn a bit of everything, and was at that point then planning on doing M&A, so mergers and acquisitions, which I studied finance. That's like the typical golden ticket you'd be after. Got into that, and then that ended before it began, but in a very fortuitous way, in the sense that after I'd lost a graduate job the day before we were due to start, believe it or not, I then created a company that I actually still have today, born out of my own frustrations in getting a graduate position. So they say everything happens for a reason, and so that was incredibly fortuitous.
Tell me about, I mean, if you would have been a pretty young fella to be setting that company up if you were at graduate age. Tell me about that. What did you set up? And yeah, I mean, I can obviously tell that it was due to the frustration of, that role not eventuating just before you were due to start. But what was the business?
Yeah, so as a grad, at least back then, the typical gate you had to go through before you got to the assessment center were psychometric tests. So people might have done one of those old SHL tests, verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, diagrammatic reasoning. So everyone had to do those. I'd be on like the student forums reading about how everyone hated them. I found them difficult. And there was an idea at that time that, they were IQ tests. So you can't really change your IQ. You have what you have. Therefore, you can't do better on the tests with practice, which is not true. I have 11 years of data to show that if you just practice learning the patterns and learning the test and get comfortable with it, you can actually improve your performance quite substantially. So I built a series of practice tests aimed at helping grads and graduates to do better on these actual tests once they went for a job and give themselves a better chance of getting to the assessment center. And so, yeah, that's what I spent most of, would have been like 2011 or 12 doing that throughout a period of unemployment because I just lost this M&A job. That's still a product of business that I have today. So, yeah, an amazing kind of turnaround to turn, what are they called? Lemons into lemonade. Is that the saying? Something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I find it really interesting. We're now in that world when it comes to psychometric testing that there are a lot of options. There are personality tests. There are things like the SHQ that things like OPQ, like abstract reasoning, verbal reasoning. Then you've got others that are more your skills-based assessments, and that there's quite a lot out there. So how does someone like myself make sense of that? Like, how do I know what is going to be right for the talent that I'm attracting into, let's say, Movember?
I would come back to what the best science has on this. And so it's this really weird thing where there's quite a big disconnect between what companies actually use in their process to hire people versus what actually works according to all the academic studies I've ever read. And so the best predictors of job performance end up being, kind of unsurprisingly, someone's intelligence, their conscientiousness, which is one of the personality traits we either have or don't have, and then the skills they have to do that specific job. So they predict performance pretty well, still with an error, it's still imperfect, but they do a pretty good job at figuring out who the best candidate is for a role versus things like unstructured interviews. In Australia, we used to have the concept of like a pub test. You just go and have a beer with someone and kind of feel them out. That kind of stuff, according to the science, is almost like flipping a coin. Like it adds no value at all. So I would probably come back to, just thinking about what you really need for the role, measuring that. If you can get someone's intelligence, that's going to be a great factor. Get someone's personality, you'll learn a little bit more. Then, of course, in the real world, you can't test people on everything. You can never be that sure. You can't give them 8 interviews. You have to kind of take your best guess from maybe a couple of interviews in a test. Like, you're going to have to work with what you have. And that's, I think, one of the hardest challenges in hiring is you're always acting on imperfect information. At the end of the day, you have to take a bit of a punt on someone.
Yeah, and I find, throughout my career, there have been, leaders that have taken punts on candidates and that's gone really well. And then on the flip side, it hasn't. And then I've, had leaders that perhaps are a little bit overly analytic and overly relying on the science to try and make that decision 100% perfect before they're willing to take any punts. Like, how do we educate our leaders in terms of what that perfect balance is and when the right time is to take a punt? Because I believe we do need to do some assessment. You know, it's not going back to the pub test days of the 1980s, right? Like, how do we make that call, and how do we educate leaders to know when the time is to go, okay, I'm going to give it a crack?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like it depends on stage of the organization, the macroeconomic conditions. So as an example, to go back to 2021, certainly in Australia where we had those closed borders, we couldn't get that high-skilled migrant labor that we rely on, particularly in tech. And any customer I spoke to was like, whoa, we can't test anyone. We can't do anything. We can interview them at most once. We just have to get them an offer because there's like 5 candidates applying for our jobs, so we can't put them through the hoops. And now I speak to the same equivalent businesses, and they're saying the exact opposite. They're saying, well, you know, I've got 1,000 applicants through LinkedIn. I want to give them a test, if nothing else, just to prove that they're interested. And I want them to show me that they really want the job. And so it's amazing how much the macroeconomic climate and the supply versus demand equation changes people's thinking completely. So I feel like it just depends on the current state of your business and your trade-offs. If you're a hyperscale company with $1 billion of funding, you're like, we just need to hire as quickly as possible, I would take a much more risk-tolerant approach. Maybe 20% of the people you hire don't work out, you get rid of them. Whereas if it's a business where we need to get just the right person, we only need one person in this team this year, we don't want to upset the balance, we don't want to add a bad seed, then it kind of makes sense to be a little bit more risk-averse and hone in a little bit further. And then you will have dealt with people who you know either fall on one end of the spectrum or another in terms of how risk-averse they are. Some people just need everything. Maybe they can dial it back a little bit. Other people maybe don't think about it enough, and they should collect a few extra bits of evidence before making the hire. So I guess although it sounds like a consultant's answer, it depends on the context.
Yeah, it does. It does. But, you know, it's something that we do face into because all of us in, you know, internal and agency, talent roles, we've got all these spinning plates happening in terms of different, you know, progress in terms of the roles that we have. And some leaders have a very different approach to the others. So it can be quite difficult to navigate through that and to have that consistent approach to, you know, identifying, but also, I suppose, assessing the talent that's coming through when our leaders have a different approach and a different expectation. So I personally have over the years found that to be quite challenging.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess it's, you know, there's something to be said for getting everyone on the same page. And this is maybe not just about a particular role, but holistically about how are we hiring, who are we hiring, what are we looking for? I can remember one of the biggest improvements we made with hiring into own company at Alooba was we did the first round of hiring. We hired some people. We fired some people. We didn't get a lot of those hires right. And then it was at that point we sat down and thought, what exactly are we looking for? You know, what are the values we have in our business? What are we trying to attract for? Where are we trying to go? Okay, let's now set up a hiring process to match that. And so, at least in my experience, I feel like when a lot of hiring processes derail is when there's this weird inconsistency where maybe the first interviewer is looking for X, Y, Z, and the second interviewer is looking for ABC, and then the recruiter or the TA is thinking, well, I can't match everyone's preferences. Like, can we get an agreement of what we're actually looking for as early on in the process as possible? Because then I think everything after that becomes a lot smoother. But yeah, getting that agreement holistically at the business level, particularly in a large organization, I can imagine is very difficult.
Absolutely. Well, I do want to talk about Alooba, but I want to walk through your career, you know, from launching your own business as a you know, recent graduate from university. Talk me through what came next and when Alooba came about.
Yeah, so I launched this other product called Grad Tests way back when, and I always had it as a side project, and it was a great way for me to learn a little bit about recruitment, a little bit about software, product development. Like, I learned everything about how to get a business started, how to get a web product going. And so that was really, really valuable. Meanwhile, I had my normal career. I started out in financial analytics, then eventually got into what we now call data analytics with a business called Hotels Combined, who are now part of Booking.com. Bit of a local Aussie tech hero, Hotels Combined, always punching above their weight. And so it was there that I got into an environment where I really felt at home, I think, with a bunch of other tech nerds, you know, doing data-y stuff and cool product stuff. And so I was there for 4 years. I ended up leading the analytics function. And a big part of my role was hiring people into the team. data analysts, data engineers, what have you. And Hotels Combined at the time is kind of odd because it was a reasonable sized company, about 200 people around the world, but no HR function at all. Zero. None. So that meant, it's very interesting, right? Yeah. Very unusual. And that meant anytime you hired as a hiring manager, you had to do everything yourself. So you had to, well, for me, I had to figure out, how the hell do I do recruitment? Because I'm a leader in the analytics function. I don't get this. So I had to, write the job ads, get the LinkedIn ads going, figure out how the LinkedIn algorithm works and when your ads are going to be shown and when they're not going to be shown. Read all these resumes, create your interview plan, create your own skills test, do the interviews. It was a lot of work, and I probably didn't know what I was doing initially, but eventually we figured it out, and the people we hired were really good. So I guess the end outcome was pretty solid from our perspective, even if it was a lot of work. And so it was throughout those 4 years especially where I felt the pain point of hiring managers in trying to get great data talent, because I was that myself. And my single biggest pain point was always, you get the job ad up on LinkedIn, you get hundreds of applications fairly easily. Maybe 5% on paper looked pretty good, seemed to have the right skills and experience. And back in those days, we did the phone screen as like the first half-hour quick intro call. And I found that the resume was such a bad predictor of who was worth speaking to. So it was very often that I get someone who looked amazing on paper, but then I'd give them what I felt were kind of softball, underarm throws in the areas we were evaluating. So for us, SQL mattered, statistics mattered, visualizations mattered. I gave them kind of warm-up questions, and so often they would kind of fail. So I found that I wanted something that was like, I don't want to give them this full take-home project because that's too much work to do for them, too much work for us to grade, but I want something in between that's going to give me like a quick snapshot of their skills in some kind of fair, scalable way, and not lead to me having to interview, 30 people to make one hire. And so that was really the origin of the idea of alooba.
And see, I love this. And I'll tell you what I really love about your story, Tim. And I often advise people to do this, and I do this myself. What you experienced as a non-HR practitioner, the complexity of the legacy in terms of how we operate as recruiters, but also the expectations that we put on candidates in terms of what that life cycle is going to look like as you apply for a role. Things like CVs, cover letters, whether it's skills testing, whether it's filling in a questionnaire, video interviewing, all the things that we've done for all of our careers as recruiters, you're looking at that with fresh eyes and without all of that, I suppose, preconceived bias in terms of what we should be doing, because there actually isn't any legal reason why we have to put people through that process, aside from, equal opportunity, and we would always have equal opportunity, but this is just process for process that we've always done.
Yes.
Were you surprised at the complexity of the way we recruit?
Yes, I was surprised by the manualness, just like the fact that so many of the steps were, in my view, tediously manual. And I want to give an interesting comparison. So I was at Hotels Combined. This is a website that even 10 years ago, in real time, you could get the rate of 1.1 million hotels in any currency, in any language, in 200 countries in real time across 50 different providers, Booking.com, Agoda, Hotels.com, Expedia. So we had that technology, which for 10 years ago is pretty complex and built out of Sydney as well. It's like not Silicon Valley. This is some really smart stuff that they put together. So that's on one side. That's the product development. On marketing, they were doing real-time updates of Google AdWord bids for billions of keywords, right? So that was pretty smart programmatic marketing. And then we had people where any leader would say, people are our most important asset. We have to hire the best people possible. And for recruitment, it's like, ad on LinkedIn, screen a bunch of CVs while you're tired and you just read 600 of them.
Yeah.
Coffee, catch up, job offer. So, well, yeah, we could do it that way. That doesn't seem like the smartest way to do it because it's tediously manual, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of forethought. Like, you know what I mean? It seems like there's some missing piece of the puzzle where it's 100% unscientific. At least that was my view. Now, I was doing it that way, so it's part of the problem as well. Like, I was just kind of doing what other people were doing, what I felt intuitively was the right thing to do. Like, I knew for example, I couldn't really offer someone a job without having seen some of their work. Like I had to somehow see what they could do, because anyone can blag. It's very easy. So you have to see some validation. But yeah, I thought it was strange how tediously manual and undata driven it was. As a data analyst, I wanted to have some numbers. Like give me any metric that I could use to make a decision. And so I came at it from a very data perspective.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Do you see value, in resumes anymore? Because I'm challenging myself on this, because I'm seeing more value working for a charity where a lot of it is, everything that we do, the people that come in, they come in because of our purpose and they want to change the face of men's health right now. I get more value from a candidate's personal connection to what we do than I do from a 4-page CV. I can see their experience on LinkedIn in a very succinct manner where I can look at it and I can see it immediately, and I'll know within 10 seconds that they've got the skills and experience that we're looking for. What I can't see is their motivations and why they're connected to our purpose. The CV just kind of feels like it complicates everything and just means that I've got to spend more time reading. Or maybe, if I'm going through hundreds of them, I'm not going to go into that much detail to see every single piece of information that someone's put the effort into writing. Like, do you still think resumes are, and CVs are fit for purpose in 2025?
No, I wish the resume would die a quick and painless death. A document, I should mention, was invented by Da Vinci 550 years ago. So that tells you how little we've progressed if we're still using that.
Right.
And it's amazing. And like for companies, I get why they use resumes, because what else are you going to go off at that point? Yeah, you've got a LinkedIn profile. You've got maybe some application questions they've filled out. But if you're choosing who to interview, that initial screening stage, in most cases, you don't have anything else to go on. So I kind of get it. But I wanted to relay a couple of anecdotes. So at Hotels Combined, I did CV screening or resume screening. And I remember we were hiring a product analyst. I had 600 candidates. I went through all of them. I had the usual problems like anyone would, which is by the time you get to the 400th, you're like, oh, my God, can I just do something else, please? Not every candidate's getting the level playing field. But I remember getting to this one candidate, got down to the hobby section, which a lot of people have, and it said semi-professional footballer in Brazil. I'm going to tell you right now, I love Brazilians straight off the bat. So I already have this massive bias in favor of Brazilians, okay, because of the football.
Right.
And we had at Sydney University 5-a-side comp every Tuesday for every semester, and we could just never get across the line. We lost the final 4 semesters in a row. And I thought, oh, my God, finally, we've got this extra player who can come onto the team and just get us across the line, get us that championship. And so I remember standing up and telling my colleagues, and I'm like, hey, look at this guy. I can't remember what his name was. Saying, and we got him in for an interview, at least partly as a result of the fact he was a semi-professional footballer in Brazil, which is stupid because there's nothing to do with him being a product analyst. So that's kind of a funny story for him, and good luck to him. But what about the 599 other candidates that I didn't interview who didn't have the same chance because they weren't a semi-professional footballer in Brazil? Like, it's so ridiculous. And that's just one bit of bias, of which there are hundreds. One I think that people really should think about is this pretty comprehensive experiments that have been done in different countries, including in Australia. So University of Sydney did one, I think it was 3 years ago, where they got thousands of different resumes, split them into 3 groups. The sets of resumes across the groups were similar to each other. The only difference between those 3 groups was the names on the resumes. Group 1 had an Anglo-Saxon first and last name. Group 2 had an Anglo first name, Chinese last name. Group 3 had a Chinese first and last name. The researchers then applied to thousands of jobs: Sydney, Melbourne, finance, HR, sales, senior, junior, like the whole kit and caboodle. They then measured the rate at which each of those applications got a callback or an email back or whatever, some kind of indicator, yet we want to interview you. Cut a long story short, the first group got a 12% callback rate. Third group got a 4% callback rate. So if you apply to a job in Australia with a Chinese name, you have 1/3 the chance of the equivalent candidate with an Anglo-Saxon name. That is bullshit. That is so unfair.
Absolutely.
It's just, like, if I was Chinese, I would be spewing that I was just discriminated against at scale when applying for a job in Australia. So, like, if we have to get rid of resumes just to solve that problem, I feel like it's worth it.
Can there be a positive bias, though? This is my question about that. I think those stats are absolutely outrageous. But, for, let's say, an educated talent professional that is wanting to provide more opportunity perhaps to disadvantaged communities, or they're wanting to diversify the cultural makeup of their organisation, or they want to increase neurodiversity because they see the value in different styles and thought leadership. If we remove those factors from the process, does that then mean that we can't be positive in terms of bias and say, hey, I want a shortlist where I have 80% of women in this technology leadership role that I'm recruiting and 20% men, because I want more representation of women in our technology team? Like, does it run that risk? So, and you can disagree with even positive bias being something, right? Because I don't even know the answer to that, but I know I am biased deliberately, particularly with female representation.
So my personal opinion is we should try to set up the hiring process so it's optimized for meritocracy, so that on average, the best, however you want to define that person, gets the job. Now, separate discussion, I think, about, well, let's deliberately kind of change the parameters so that this segment of people have a slightly higher chance because they don't have the same level playing field to begin with, and I get all that.
That's right.
I would say if that were the case, I would just explicitly kind of call it out in the hiring process rather than have it as one bit of 100 bits of noise in the resume. So, for example, maybe it's on the application form. It's like, well, collect those fields, collect the sex, collect the sexual orientation, collect the whatever the segments are, and then they somehow get promoted in the kind of ranking of the candidates that's otherwise done in an objective way. So like in our system, like we've had a customer ask us about that exact thing. So our system, you do a test, you've got this rank ordered list of scores, you've scored 80% in this, 50% of this. Oh, just have some extra factor like positive bias factor or something. And okay, anyone gets an extra 20% or something. Because then at least it's explicit, because I think without that, it's just who knows who's being screened and for what reason. Like you've got these explicit ideas of how to promote these people, but what about all the unconscious ones? What about all the other stuff that's going on when you see all those little bits of noise from a resume? Who knows what's going on in our heads? We're too complex to understand.
I think it's absolutely the answer, right? You do need to be very succinct in terms of what you are asking, because otherwise we are making assumptions. It could be assumptions on gender, or it could be assumptions on, based on someone's name, and a name may not mean anything, right? Like, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that's really good advice, and advice that I'll definitely be taking on. I love episodes like this where I'm learning from guests. So this is fabulous, Tim. Now, we are here to talk about alooba, though. Tell me about the platform and where it plays in this space.
Yes. Yeah, so we started out life as alooba trying to solve the problem I had as a hiring manager in analytics, which was I'm trying to hire great data analysts, data scientists, SQL developers, these kinds of characters. And as I said, I mentioned I wasted a lot of time reviewing CVs manually. So the initial idea was like, could we have a skills assessment platform specifically for data roles? The idea being that mainly it would be a screening tool. Of course, a lot's changed over the course of the business. It was our 6th birthday on Saturday, actually. So what's happened during that time?
That's great. That's awesome.
Yeah, we had an ice cream, a cake at McDonald's, like any 6-year-old. So that was good fun. And,
brilliant.
And yeah, so a lot's changed in 6 years. So we've gone from not just data, but to kind of any role in business. We've gone not just technical skills, but to any skill. We've gone not just skills, but into the psychometrics, the personality, the intelligence testing, the what have you. So we now have this more holistic platform where you can kind of evaluate anything you like. And we've got a variety of customers use it in different ways, as a screening platform, as a kind of later, more in-depth assessment instead of having their own take-home assessment. So it's used in a variety of different ways. I think at the moment, the biggest value add is probably in some kind of early stage evaluation, because of the 120 guests I've spoken to in the last 4 months on the Objective Hiring Show, I reckon comfortably 100 have said, we're putting up ads on LinkedIn. We're getting a ton of applicants. They look amazing. The CV seems almost too good to be true. It matches the JD perfectly. We get in for the first interview. It's, okay, I can see you've just used ChatGPT to optimize your CV.
That's right.
You don't really have the skills you're saying you have. And so we need some basic validation layer because we just can't take the resume for granted.
So can we bring alooba to the top of the funnel pre-CV? Is that something that we could do? Like we could have, and look, I'm all for advertising, right? Because I think the general population will look for a job advertisement at this stage. We haven't shifted enough for them not to. So if I'm either not working or I'm ready to make a move, the first thing I'm going to do is look on LinkedIn. Yep. Or for some segments, seek, right? But do you think, like, rather than saying apply for the role and go through the ATS, we could bring alooba to the top of the funnel and eliminate all of that kind of bias that goes on when we're looking over hundreds and hundreds of CVs?
Yes, and so lots of our customers do it that way. So we integrate into some of the popular ATSs, Greenhouse, Lever, Smart Recruiters. And for those companies that attract a very large volume of candidates especially, then it makes a lot of sense because if you're getting 1,000 applicants for a role, even if you wanted to resume screen manually, which, as we've discussed, has a lot of flaws, you can't. Like, unless you've got the world's largest TA team, you have to have some kind of automation in place. And so I think having, short, sharp skills assessment customized for the role, so it's relevant, it can't be irrelevant. You can't have an experience where a candidate takes this test and they're looking at the job ad and like, what the hell is this test? Like, it's got no connection at all. So it has to be relevant, has to be customized for that job. And then, you eliminate all that bias because then you just have this set of numbers. In our product, actually, we have a feature called candidate cloaking. So you can turn that on. And so that gets rid of the name, gets rid of the email address, gets rid of the country the person's in, gets rid of all these things that really don't matter in making that evaluation. And you can look just at the numbers. And so, again, we're trying to have this more meritocratic approach where we think it helps eliminate a lot of this bias and just focuses on, like, what do I actually want in this role? Let's measure that as best as we can, even if it's imperfect, and select candidates on the basis of that.
And from my understanding, it's not just the technical skills that they've developed through their experience, it's human skills as well. Like, what are some examples that we could put in there? Is it things like creativity? Is it things like problem solving? What are some of those kind of creative skills that could come, human skills that could come out?
Yeah, so it's the full gamut now of technical and softer or human skills that you can evaluate in the product in a variety of different test types. What I would say in general is I feel like there's, and this is maybe one of the big challenges in hiring, is the non-technical skills are inherently a little bit more subjective. So let's say even communication skills as an example. I bet if you surveyed 10 people and said, hey, like, describe to me what good or not so good communication skills is, they'd all have different answers.
Oh, absolutely.
And so that, I think, is the difficulty in any stage, whether it's an interview or a test or anything, when you're trying to evaluate those softer, more subjective skills, you do run into that challenge where it's not going to be as precise as, well, here's this Python code, here's this SQL, here's this data analysis. Either you got it right or you didn't. And so that's the challenge. But yes, we cover the full gamut now of not just hard and soft skills, but also the personality, the intelligence, and anything else you want to evaluate, really.
Which is fabulous because, like I said at the start of it, like, all of this can be difficult to navigate because there are so many variations and so many options, and to be able to have that holistic view of the human that is applying for the role and not just their CV and experience is incredibly valuable. And I know from myself, I am going through transformation of talent, but the current process is incredibly manual, as you described, and I'm kind of right now, and things will be changing in a couple of weeks because we're about to launch a new tech stack, but right now I'm where you were at Hotels Combined when you first started going through all of those CVs, right? So I see the value of this. I think it's fabulous. How can our audience find out more? How can they reach out to you to learn more about alooba?
So they can check out our website. That's alooba.com, alooba.com. They could also find me on LinkedIn, Tim Freestone Alooba, and I should come up right near the top of those results.
Fabulous. Tim, I think we could have talked for another hour or so. We better wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining the Rubberband podcast today. I can't wait to see more of alooba, so I'll be probably the first person reaching out to you, or consider this me reaching out. And we will talk soon. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. It was a blast.
Thanks, mate.